A single story of a world-ending flood appears in hundreds of human cultures. That is not a coincidence, it is a mystery. Today we will confront that ancient legend with the hard evidence of modern geology, and you will learn what the Earth itself has to say about humanity's oldest nightmare. We will see why a literal global deluge is scientifically impossible, yet discover the terrifying, real-world catastrophes that could have inspired these tales across continents. How could the same story echo from the mountains of Mesopotamia to the peaks of the Andes? What does it say about us that we have never stopped telling it? Picture a crackling fire in the deep darkness of a prehistoric night. An elder's voice, low and steady, describes a time when the skies opened and the world was swallowed by water. Wide-eyed listeners huddle closer, feeling the chill of the story in their bones. This scene did not happen just once. It was repeated with different faces and different languages for thousands of years on every continent humanity has ever called home. The story of a great flood is not an isolated legend. It is a human phenomenon. Beyond the well-known account of Noah, scholars have catalogued over 200 distinct cultural traditions that tell of a cataclysmic deluge. The ancient Sumerians wrote of Ziusudra, who built a great boat on the advice of a kindly god. The Maya Popol Vuh tells of a world made of wood, destroyed by a black resinous rain sent by angry deities. In Greece, Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha survived the wrath of Zeus by floating in a chest, later repopulating the earth by throwing stones over their shoulders, which miraculously turned into people. From the mountains of India to the islands of the Pacific, the same core narrative echoes: a divine warning, a chosen survivor, a vessel of salvation, and a world washed clean, ready for rebirth. Folklorist and historian of science Dr. Adrian Mayer calls this field of study geomythology. The idea that these persistent stories might be ancient, poetic records of real geological events passed down over countless generations. So we are left with a profound question. Why would cultures with no possible contact, separated by vast oceans and mountain ranges, all dream up the same specific nightmare? What does this universal human impulse reveal about our deepest fears, our relationship with an unpredictable natural world, and our need to find meaning in catastrophe? This shared tapestry of memory, woven from hundreds of threads, is our starting point. It is the compelling mystery that demands we look beyond the story and search for the ground truth. The sheer number of these stories is staggering, but their true power lies in their structure. When you place them side by side, from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, they read like different chapters of the same ancient book. It is as if every culture was handed a set of core ingredients and told to write a recipe for the end of the world. The first ingredient is almost always the cause. A divine punishment for human misbehavior, a cosmic imbalance that must be corrected, or simply the capricious decision of a powerful being. This speaks to a universal human need to find reason within catastrophe, to believe that such immense suffering must have a purpose, even if that purpose is a lesson taught through hardship. Next comes the hero, the singular figure chosen to remember. Sometimes they are perfectly righteous, like Noah, warned because of his virtue. Other times they are clever tricksters, surviving not through piety but through wit, like the man in many Native American traditions who ties himself to the tallest tree. Then the means of salvation. This is where local geography paints the picture. In seafaring or river-based cultures, it is invariably a boat, an ark, a great vessel. But in landlocked regions or dense jungles, salvation becomes a giant hollowed-out gourd, a sealed clay jar, or that climb up the world's tallest pine. Finally, the proof of landfall, the moment hope is tested. The released bird that returns with an olive branch is the most famous, but other stories tell of animals sent to dive deep and bring back mud, proving the waters are receding and solid earth awaits. Comparative mythologist Joseph Campbell saw this entire sequence as a profound chapter in the universal hero's journey. The flood represents the ultimate descent into chaos, the dissolution of all known order. The survivor's ordeal in the ark or on the mountain is the critical trial in the belly of the whale, and their emergence onto a cleansed world is the ultimate return, bearing the potential for a new beginning. This is not a collection of random campfire tales. This is a precise, recurring blueprint for a story about annihilation and rebirth. Every culture dressed the characters in local clothes and set the stage with familiar landscapes, but the plot remained hauntingly consistent. Such a specific, global pattern does not emerge from pure imagination. It points irresistibly toward a shared human experience so profound, so terrifying, that the only way to process it was to weave it into the very fabric of our collective memory. The myth is the echo, but what was the original sound? The search for that original sound leads us to a single, silent room in the British Museum. Here, under glass, rests a collection of cracked clay tablets, inscribed with the precise wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform script. They were excavated from the Royal Library of Nineveh, capital of the Assyrian Empire, a treasure trove of knowledge buried for over 2,500 years. Among them was a set of 12 tablets containing the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest works of literature ever discovered, and on the 11th of those tablets, a king's quest for immortality is interrupted by a story far older than himself. Gilgamesh meets a man named Utnapishtim, the only mortal to have been granted eternal life by the gods, and Utnapishtim tells him why. Long ago, he says, the great gods decided to wipe out humanity with a flood. But one deity, chose to subvert their decree. Speaking not to Utnapishtim directly, but to the reed walls of his house, whispered a warning of the coming storm and instructions to build a great vessel. Utnapishtim listened. He built a massive cube-shaped boat, sealing it with bitumen, a natural tar, and loaded it with his family, craftsmen, and the seed of all living things. The storm came, described with terrifying force. For 6 days and 7 nights the tempest raged, so violent that even the gods trembled and retreated to the highest heaven. On the 7th day the sea grew calm. Utnapishtim's boat had come to rest on a mountain. He released a dove which found no place to land and returned. He released a swallow which also came back. Finally, he released a raven which saw the waters receding, found food, and did not return. It was the sign that life could begin again. The parallels to the later biblical story are not just similar, they are structurally identical. The divine warning, the detailed construction, the sealing with pitch, the catastrophic storm, the resting on a mountain, the sequence of birds. This was not a coincidence. The Gilgamesh epic was itself a retelling of an even older narrative, the Akkadian Atrahasis epic, which gives us the clearest reason for the gods' decision. The text reads, "The noise of mankind has become too intense for me. With their din I am deprived of sleep." It was not mere wickedness, but the overwhelming clamor of an overpopulous, industrious humanity that drove the divine council to order a reset. Here, in the baked clay of Mesopotamia, we find the source code. This is the oldest written version of the flood story humanity possesses, predating the biblical account by well over 1,000 years. It shows a civilization already grappling with this foundational myth, refining it, writing it down. The discovery of these tablets in the 19th century sent shockwaves through the scholarly world, proving that this core narrative was not unique to one tradition, but was a powerful, shared inheritance from the dawn of recorded history. The myth had a birthplace, and we could now read its original manual, but a story written in clay is one thing. Could such an event have left a mark on the clay of the earth itself? The waves that crashed against Mesopotamian riverbanks found their echo on shores an ocean away, while the story of the Ark was being carved into clay in the Near East. Entirely separate civilizations across the Atlantic were telling their own versions of the world's end by water, shaped not by reed boats but by towering mountains and dense rainforests. The Aztecs of central Mexico believed the cosmos had been destroyed and remade multiple times, each era called a sun. The third sun, known as the Sun of Water, ended in a catastrophic deluge. The rain fell so heavily and for so long that the sky itself collapsed upon the earth, drowning all of humanity. Only a man and a woman survived, not by a boat, but by transforming into dogs to hide inside a giant hollowed-out cypress tree, a salvation rooted in the local landscape. Far to the south, in the Andes, the Incas told of Yunu Pachacuti, a great flood that poured from the heavens. According to their tradition, only a man and woman found refuge inside a sealed box that floated on the rising waters. When the flood receded, the box came to rest on a peak in the high mountains, and from that couple, the Inca people were reborn. Here, the vessel is not a grand ship, but a simple container, and the landing place is not Mount Ararat, but a sacred Andean summit, weaving the universal tale into the very bedrock of their world. These stories were not preserved on clay tablets or parchment scrolls, but in the living memory of communities, passed from elder to child across countless generations. Anthropologists who study oral traditions note the incredible precision and stability these narratives can maintain, acting as a verbal library for cultures without a written language. The details are not random. They are deeply adaptive, reflecting the specific environment and values of the people who tell them. For the Mapuche people of Chile, the Great Flood was not sent by a distant god, but was the result of a cosmic battle between two giant snakes, Kai Kai and Tren Tren, whose struggle caused the seas to rise and the mountains to grow. This explanation ties the cataclysm directly to the powerful, ever-present forces of the local natural world. Perhaps the most striking adaptation comes from the Hopi people of the American Southwest. In their tradition, when the world was corrupted, the virtuous were not told to build a boat. Instead, they were led by ant people down into the safety of subterranean chambers called kivas, where they waited out the destruction. Salvation came not from floating above the chaos, but from seeking shelter deep within the earth itself. This is the profound realization. These American narratives, from the Aztec Valley to the Andean peaks to the Hopi mesas, evolved in complete and total isolation from the flood stories of Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean. There was no ancient transoceanic contact, no shared scroll of instructions, yet they all arrived at the same core conclusion: a world-cleansing flood. Select survivors, a fresh start for humanity. This independent invention is one of the most compelling pieces of evidence we have. It strongly suggests these stories are not mere copies of a single, forgotten original text, but are separate, powerful reactions to a shared type of experience. If cultures that never met all tell of a great flood, then the source of the myth likely lies not in a single event, but in something fundamental to the human condition or to the planet we all inhabit. The stories are the responses, but to understand the question they are answering, we must leave the realm of myth and step into the field of geology to ask what the earth itself remembers. But if the myth is so powerful and so widespread, the earth itself must hold a verdict. To find it, we must leave the world of stories and step into a different kind of room, a quiet laboratory filled not with ancient tablets, but with shelves of rock samples, core drills, and microscopes. This is the domain of geology, where the planet's autobiography is written in stone, layer by patient layer, and what this science tells us creates a profound puzzle. The evidence in the rock record is clear and seemingly definitive. A single planet-covering flood that submerged every mountain, exactly as the myths describe, is a geological impossibility. Let's begin with the most basic question. Where would all that water come from? To cover the entire planet, including the summit of Mount Everest, you would need a volume of water roughly 1.5 times the total amount of water in all of Earth's oceans today. That is an almost unimaginable quantity. All the water in the atmosphere, all the glaciers, all the groundwater, every lake and river combined, represents less than 2% of the water in the oceans. There simply is not, and never has been, a hidden reservoir of that magnitude, and if by some mechanism that water did appear, where did it go? The myths say it receded, but water does not vanish. It would still be here, and our continents would be forever drowned. The rock layers themselves offer an even more direct testimony. Geology operates on a few fundamental principles, and one of the most important is the law of superposition. In simple terms, it states that in an undisturbed sequence of sedimentary rocks, the oldest layers are at the bottom, and the youngest are at the top. It is a straightforward concept, like reading a book from the first page to the last. A global flood, a single catastrophic event, would act like a giant blender, churning up the entire surface of the planet. It would deposit one massive, worldwide layer of sediment, a chaotic mixture of everything from every continent and every time period, all dumped together in a single, thick band of mud and debris. Then, as the waters receded, that would be it. One layer. That is not what we see, not even close. What geologists actually find are thousands upon thousands of distinct layers, stacked in a specific, logical order that tells a story of deep time. You have vast deserts of sandstone, then ancient seabeds of limestone, then coal swamps, then volcanic ash deposits, each representing a different environment that lasted for millions of years. These layers are not mixed, they are sequential, and their order is consistent across the globe. You do not find dinosaur fossils in the same layer as trilobites, which lived hundreds of millions of years earlier. The fossil record shows a beautiful, orderly progression of life, from simple to complex, not a chaotic jumble of every creature that ever lived, buried together in one cataclysmic event. Geophysicist Dr. Maura O'Connor, who studies large-scale Earth processes, puts it plainly: a global flood would leave a single, unmistakable signature in the geological record, a layer we could point to on every continent and say, here, this is when it happened. That layer does not exist. What we have instead is a complex, layered narrative of environmental change that unfolds over billions of years. So here we arrive at the central tension of our entire exploration. On one hand, we have this breathtakingly universal human story, echoed in hundreds of cultures. On the other, we have the calm, methodical verdict of modern Earth science, which states that the literal event described could not have occurred. It feels like an impasse. One must be wrong, but what if we are asking the wrong question? What if the power of the myth is not in recording a single global event, but in remembering a different kind of truth altogether? The calm logic of geology seemed to have closed the case, but it also opened a new and more fascinating door. If the entire planet was never submerged, what localized event could have been so devastating, so world-ending for the people who witnessed it, that its story would echo for millennia? That question led two marine geologists on a research voyage into the heart of a modern mystery. In the 1990s, William Ryan and Walter Pittman guided their vessel across the dark, deep waters of the Black Sea. They were not searching for myths. They were reading the seabed with sonar and coring drills, pulling up long cylinders of sediment that held a layered history. What they found within those mud cores was a startling clue. Buried deep beneath the saltwater mud, they discovered the fossilized shells of tiny mollusks, species that could only have lived in a calm, freshwater lake. It was as if they had pulled up evidence of an entire lost world from the bottom of the ocean. This discovery was the cornerstone of their groundbreaking hypothesis, now known as the Black Sea Deluge theory. They proposed that for thousands of years after the last ice age, what is now the Black Sea was not a sea at all. It was a vast, isolated freshwater lake, lying hundreds of feet below the level of the world's rising oceans. Its shores would have been a fertile paradise for early Neolithic farming communities, a cradle of some of humanity's first settled villages. Then, around 7,600 years ago, a natural dam of land where the Bosporus Strait is today finally gave way. The rising Mediterranean Sea, fed by melting glaciers, found its weak point. Ryan and Pittman's models suggest what happened next was not a gentle trickle. It was a cataclysm of biblical proportions. Saltwater thundered through the breach in a roaring cascade they estimated to be 200 times the volume of Niagara Falls. The lake's surface, they argued, could have risen by as much as 6 inches per day relentlessly for months on end. Imagine standing on that ancient shoreline. You are a farmer, your life defined by the seasons, the soil, the predictable rhythms of your ancestors. One day, you notice the water at the edge of your field is a little closer than it was yesterday. A week later, it has swallowed your lowest pasture. There is no stopping it, no understanding it. Day after day, week after week, the horizon of water advances, swallowing forests, hills, and villages whole. The world you knew literally disappears beneath the waves. In a single human lifetime, an inland sea the size of the state of Florida was born, drowning over 60,000 square miles of fertile land. The psychological impact of such an event is almost impossible to overstate. For the scattered survivors who fled inland, carrying only what they could, this was not a local flood. It was the end of their entire world. Their story of the devouring waters would have traveled with them, up river valleys and along early trade routes, becoming a foundational trauma passed from parent to child. Over generations, as the story migrated, the specific lake could become a world, and the local shoreline disaster could transform into a legend of a global deluge. Here was the elegant bridge between myth and geology. Ryan and Pittman did not find evidence for Noah's flood. They found evidence for a flood that could have made Noah's story feel true. A real, terrifying, and geographically perfect cataclysm that provided the raw, emotional material from which a universal myth could be woven. It was a hypothesis that gave the ancient stories a plausible birthplace, not in the clouds, but in the very real and unstable geography of a world emerging from an ice age. The Black Sea hypothesis offers a compelling local source, but the echoes of the flood story are too widespread to be explained by a single regional event. To find a truly global trigger, we must widen our view to the scale of an entire planet waking from a deep freeze. At the end of the last ice age, the world looked nothing like the maps we know today. Vast ice sheets miles thick blanketed much of North America and Northern Europe. So much water was locked up in this frozen state that global sea levels were over 100 meters lower. Coastlines extended far beyond their current boundaries, exposing vast plains and fertile shelves where early human communities could thrive. Then the Great Thaw began. The transition was not a smooth, gentle warming. It was a turbulent stop-and-start process punctuated by violent climatic lurches. And within this chaotic period, paleoclimatologists have identified moments of breathtakingly rapid change known as meltwater pulses. One of the most significant is called Meltwater Pulse 1A. It occurred roughly 14,500 years ago. In the span of just a few centuries, possibly even less, global sea levels rose by approximately 20 meters. That is a vertical rise equal to the height of a 6-story building, happening across every ocean on Earth. Dr. Anya Sharma, a paleoclimatologist who studies these ancient climate shifts, describes the mechanism. The retreating ice sheets did not simply melt like a slow ice cube on a summer day. They were dynamic, unstable systems. Imagine a colossal ice dam holding back a vast inland lake of meltwater the size of a modern sea. When that dam finally ruptured, it would have unleashed a catastrophic deluge into the ocean basin. Or picture sections of an ice sheet collapsing wholesale into the sea, causing a sudden, massive displacement of water. These were not gentle surges, they were geological shocks. For the human populations living on those exposed coastal plains, this era was not a single flood story. It was an unending chapter of them. A community might settle a rich estuary near the sea. Over a generation, they would notice the tides creeping farther inland each year, swallowing familiar fishing grounds. They would retreat, only to have their new home threatened a generation later by a sudden, catastrophic flood from a bursting glacial lake 100 miles inland, sending a wall of water and debris down the river valley. The ocean itself was advancing, but the danger also came from the dying ice itself. In sudden, violent outbursts, the experience would have been one of profound and relentless loss. The very ground beneath their feet, the landscapes that held their stories and hunting grounds, was being permanently erased by a force they could neither control nor comprehend. Over just a few hundred years, an area of land larger than the entire continent of Europe was swallowed by the rising seas. This was not a myth about the world ending. For countless coastal societies, it was the observed, terrifying reality of their world ending. The memory of such an era would not be a precise record of dates and meters of sea level rise. It would condense into a powerful, simplified narrative. The relentless encroachment of countless floods over generations would become the Great Flood. The collective trauma of losing ancestral lands becomes the story of a world wiped clean. This hypothesis provides a different, yet equally profound, source for the myth. It suggests the flood story is not a memory of one place, but a shared memory of one terrifying time. A time when water was the dominant, unstoppable force in human life, reshaping continents and rewriting the map of human existence itself. It transforms the legend from a specific event into a profound metaphor for an entire age of loss and displacement, echoing down the millennia in the stories we never stopped telling. Yet another force could rewrite coastlines in a single, terrifying day. Picture not the slow creep of rising seas, but the ocean itself rearing up as a mountain of water, a tsunami of unimaginable scale. This hypothesis shifts the focus from climate to catastrophe, from patient melting to sudden, violent shocks to the planet's system. The geological record holds evidence for events so powerful they could carve entire chapters of human memory in a matter of hours. One of the most well-documented occurred in the North Atlantic around 6,200 years before the Common Era. Off the coast of Norway, a vast section of the continental shelf known as the Storegga Slide gave way. An area of seabed the size of Scotland broke free and plunged into the deep ocean abyss. The energy released was staggering, displacing a colossal volume of water and sending a series of mega-tsunamis radiating outward. Waves estimated to be over 20 meters high would have slammed into the coastlines of Norway, Iceland, Scotland, and the Faroe Islands. For the Mesolithic communities living along those shores, it was not a flood from the sky. It was the sea itself attacking, surging miles inland, scouring away forests, camps, and everything in their path. The archaeological record shows settlements along certain coastlines were abandoned at precisely this time. A disaster of this magnitude, striking without warning, would have been seared into the consciousness of every survivor, a story of the day the ocean rose up to reclaim the land. But could the trigger come from even farther away, from beyond our world itself? This brings us to one of the most debated ideas in recent Earth science, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. Proponents suggest that around 12,800 years ago, as the last ice age was receding, a comet or series of comet fragments exploded in the atmosphere above North America or struck the ice sheet itself. The proposed effects read like a checklist for apocalypse. Widespread wildfires would have raged across continents. The soot and dust thrown into the atmosphere could have plunged the warming planet back into a sudden, 1,000-year deep freeze known as the Younger Dryas period. And critically for our story, if a fragment struck a major ice sheet or a shallow ocean, it could have generated continent-spanning mega-tsunamis. Geomorphologist Dr. Liam Chen, who studies catastrophic landscapes, offers a measured perspective. The evidence for a specific extraterrestrial impact at that exact time remains highly controversial within the scientific community, and many proposed markers have been challenged. However, he notes the power of tsunamis to etch themselves into human memory is undeniable. A single such wave, generated by any means, is an event of pure, unadulterated terror. For a coastal community, it is not a weather event. It is the horizon disappearing, replaced by a roaring, all-consuming wall. The very language of some flood myths aligns with this experience. Stories that speak of the sky falling or of the sea rising up in anger could be the poetic translation of witnessing a tsunami's approach, where the boundary between ocean and sky truly seems to vanish. This hypothesis adds a crucial layer of suddenness and apocalyptic violence to the tapestry of possible origins. It suggests that the flood story might not only remember rising waters, but also the instant, world-shattering moment that caused them. Whether from a collapsing seafloor or a celestial impact, the shared human experience here is one of profound shock, of a stable world undone in the time it takes to draw a single breath. The legend becomes a vessel for that specific, paralyzing fear of the ground or the sea betraying you all at once. So the Earth's crust holds its own library, a silent archive written in mud and stone. To read it, we must learn its language, the subtle grammar of sediment and pressure. This is where geology moves from theory to detective work, examining the physical pages of our planet's history for the fingerprints of ancient water. One of the most precise methods comes from the quiet depths of glacial lakes. In these cold, still waters, a seasonal rhythm creates a natural ledger. Each summer, melting ice carries coarse sediment into the lake, where it settles as a pale, sandy layer. In winter, when the water is sealed by ice, only the finest clay particles drift down, forming a thin, dark band. One light and one dark pair represent a single year. These are called varves, and by counting them like tree rings, scientists can build a precise timeline stretching back thousands of years. Within that timeline, a single, abnormally thick layer of coarse rubble tells a clear story. It marks a year when something extraordinary happened, when meltwater surged with violent force, carrying a heavy load of debris into the lake's calm embrace. It is a flood recorded with annual precision. For even more dramatic events, geologists search for turbidites. Imagine an underwater landslide on a continental slope. A chaotic slurry of sand, mud, and rock roars down into the deep ocean, traveling for miles along the seafloor before finally settling. This deposit forms a distinct layer with a telltale pattern, coarse grains at the bottom grading smoothly upward to fine silt at the top. Each turbidite is the fossilized signature of a single, powerful submarine event, a sudden rush of deep-sea chaos. And then there are the rip-up clasts, perhaps the most visceral clue of all. These are not mere pebbles. They are chunks of older, solidified mudstone or shale, sometimes as large as a car, that have been torn from a riverbed or seafloor by the sheer violence of flowing water. They are then carried along and buried within a new layer of sediment. Finding them is like finding a piece of a shattered road embedded in a new landslide deposit, undeniable proof of catastrophic force. The textbook example of this geological detective work is not a subtle layer in a core sample, but an entire landscape shouting its history from every cliff and canyon. In eastern Washington state, a region known as the Channeled Scablands looks like the surface of an alien world. Across hundreds of square miles, the bedrock is scoured clean, carved into massive channels, potholes, and towering dry waterfalls. For decades, this bizarre terrain puzzled geologists. Then, in the 1920s, a scientist named J. Harlan Bretz proposed a radical idea. He argued the Scablands were not carved slowly by rivers, but catastrophically by a flood of unimaginable scale. He was initially ridiculed, but the evidence was overwhelming. Ripple marks on the canyon floors were not inches high, like those in a stream, but dozens of feet from crest to crest, requiring flows of immense depth and speed. The only possible source was a vast glacial lake, Lake Missoula, which formed behind an ice dam in present-day Montana. When that dam failed, not once but repeatedly over centuries, it unleashed walls of water taller than skyscrapers that raced across the landscape at highway speeds, stripping away soil and carving solid basalt in a matter of days. Bretz was ultimately vindicated. The Channeled Scablands stand as geology's definitive proof that catastrophic, biblical-scale floods are real and leave unmistakable scars. This is the crucial pivot in our understanding. Geologists have absolutely found the evidence for colossal, regional deluges. They can read them in varves, in turbidites, in rip-up clasts, and in entire rewritten landscapes. The science is robust and clear. What has never been found, despite over 2 centuries of searching, is the one layer that a true global flood would demand. There is no single, synchronous band of chaotic debris sitting atop all the older rocks on every continent, from the peaks of the Andes to the plains of Africa. The Earth's library contains many dramatic stories of local and regional disaster written in stone, but the book with a single, global cataclysm on page 1 is simply not on the shelf. Standing before the towering skeleton of a Tyrannosaurus rex in a museum hall, we are in the presence of deep time. Those massive bones, silent and still, seem like perfect evidence for a sudden, violent end. It is a natural thought. If a worldwide flood churned across the planet, would it not bury creatures exactly like this, leaving them to fossilize where they fell? This intuitive leap has made the fossil record a cornerstone for many arguments supporting a global deluge. But when we listen closely to what these stones are actually saying, they tell a very different story, one that quietly refutes the idea of a single, year-long catastrophe. Fossilization is not a simple process of death and burial. It is a rare and specific geological lottery. For a creature to become a fossil, it typically needs to be buried rapidly after its passing, often in waterborne sediment like silt or volcanic ash, which protects it from scavengers and decay. Then, over immense spans of time, minerals slowly replace the original organic material, turning bone or shell into stone. A global flood could certainly provide that initial rapid burial. But here is the critical distinction. While floods can create fossils, the global pattern of fossils we find could not have been created by one flood. The most powerful testimony is the order. Go to any Grand Canyon, any exposed cliff face where Earth's layers are visible, and you will see a sequence. At the very bottom, in the oldest rocks, you find only the simplest life. Strange, shelled creatures, trilobites, the ancient residents of primal seas. There are no birds, no mammals, no flowers in these deep layers. Move upward through the strata and new forms appear. The middle layers hold the great reptiles, the dinosaurs, alongside ancient trees like ferns and cycads. Continue upward and the dinosaurs vanish. In their place, the rocks begin to yield the bones of early mammals, and eventually, much closer to the surface, the remains of creatures we would recognize today. This is not a random jumble. It is a consistent, worldwide library where the books are arranged in a precise chronological order. If a single flood had scrambled the entire planet, it would have mixed this library into chaos. We would find mammoth bones alongside Tyrannosaurus rex teeth, and human tools embedded with extinct sea scorpions. We simply do not. Consider a specific page from this stone diary, the Burgess Shale. High in the Canadian Rockies, this deposit preserves a breathtaking snapshot of life from over 500 million years ago. Here, not just shells and bones, but the delicate impressions of soft-bodied creatures, worms, primitive arthropods, strange filter feeders, are captured in exquisite detail. They were buried in a sudden underwater mudslide, a local event that preserved a single community from an ancient seafloor. It is a fossilized moment, not a global catastrophe. This is the consistent pattern. Fossil beds around the world capture specific ecosystems: a Jurassic lagoon, a Cretaceous river delta, an Eocene rainforest, each buried by its own local disaster, and each occupying its own specific chapter in the vast book of time. So we must ask a simple, revealing question. If a flood powerful enough to cover Everest swept across the world, why is the resulting fossil record so meticulously sorted? Why are all the fish not at the top and all the mountain goats not at the bottom? The ordered sequence of life, from simple to complex, from sea to land, is the signature of evolution over hundreds of millions of years. It is the record of a changing planet, not a planet changed in a single year. The fossils, often cited as proof of the flood, become instead one of its most profound and silent refutations. They speak not of a single violent year, but of a long, patient, and deeply layered history. Deep within the polar ice caps, Earth keeps another kind of diary. In the silent, frozen expanses of Greenland and Antarctica, scientists drill down not for oil or minerals, but for memory itself. They extract slender, gleaming cylinders of ancient ice, some over 2 miles long. These are ice cores, and they are perhaps the most elegant climate archives on the planet. Each year's snowfall, compacted under the weight of centuries, forms a distinct layer, preserving within it a snapshot of that year's atmosphere. By carefully analyzing these cores, glaciologists can read an annual record of Earth's climate stretching back an astonishing 800,000 years. This frozen library offers a second, independent test for the Great Flood Hypothesis, one written not in stone but in snow and trapped air. The process is meticulous. In a specialized clean lab, scientists melt a section of the core, capturing the ancient air bubbles that have been imprisoned within the ice for millennia. The composition of these gases, particularly the ratios of different oxygen isotopes, tells a precise story about global temperature at the time the snow fell. Layers of fine volcanic ash, carried by winds from eruptions around the world, provide exact time markers like dated bookmarks in the frozen text. So, what would this polar record show if a global deluge had occurred within the last 100,000 years? Glaciologist Dr. Elena Vance, who has spent years studying these cores, outlines the clear signature such an event would leave. First, you would expect a massive, global layer of meltwater. A flood of that scale would involve a sudden, enormous transfer of energy, warming the atmosphere and leaving a pronounced melt layer in the ice across both poles. Second, the isotopic signature would show a dramatic, planet-wide spike, indicating a sudden and extreme climatic shift. And third, the violent churning of the oceans and continents would loft an immense amount of dust and sea salt into the atmosphere, depositing a thick, global band of particulates in the ice, a dirty layer visible to the naked eye across every core extracted. The ice cores reveal a climate history of breathtaking drama, but it is not the drama of a single flood. They record the slow, rhythmic pulse of ice ages, the abrupt, jarring cold snaps like the Younger Dryas period, and the traces of countless volcanic eruptions. They show the steady rise in greenhouse gases since the Industrial Revolution. What they do not show anywhere in the last 100,000 years of impeccable record is that triple signature. There is no synchronous global melt layer, no catastrophic isotopic spike, and no worldwide band of flood debris. The poles, watching from the top and bottom of the world, remained relatively stable through the periods when human flood myths were taking shape. This is a powerful, independent corroboration. The rocks said no, now the ice agrees. Two separate planetary archives, one made of stone and one made of frozen time, tell the same story. They chronicle a dynamic, sometimes violently changing Earth, but one where catastrophe is always regional, never total. The flood that could drown all human memory left no trace in humanity's oldest frozen memories. While other heroes built arks, a different kind of savior was remembered along the banks of the Yellow River. Ancient Chinese texts tell of a time when the waters rose without cease, creating a landscape of endless, terrifying marsh. The hero who emerged was not a pious survivor chosen for his faith, but a tireless engineer named Yu. For 13 arduous years, he did not flee the deluge. He labored to master it, dredging canals and redirecting rivers, channeling the chaotic waters back to the sea. His hands became calloused, his body worn, and legend says he passed his own home 3 times without entering, so dedicated was he to his public duty. When the flood finally receded, Yu had not just survived a punishment, he had imposed order upon chaos, and for this monumental effort, he was rewarded with the mandate of heaven, becoming the founder of the Xia dynasty, China's first legendary ruling house. This story presents a fascinating contrast to the Mesopotamian and biblical traditions. In those Western narratives, the flood is a divine reset, a response to human noise or wickedness. Salvation comes through obedience to a specific warning and faith in a protective vessel. The focus is on the justice of the gods and the righteousness of the survivor. Emperor Yu's tale reflects a different set of cultural priorities entirely. Here, the flood is presented more as a natural disaster, a cosmic problem of imbalance between earth and water. The solution is not escape, but human ingenuity, relentless perseverance, and bureaucratic organization. Yu succeeds through applied intelligence and a selfless commitment to the greater good, virtues that became cornerstones of Confucian statecraft. His story legitimizes the very idea of a centralized state by presenting its founder as the one who literally shaped the habitable land and brought order from aquatic chaos. This adaptation is a powerful example of what scholars term cultural memory, a real, recurring trauma. The catastrophic and frequent flooding of the Yellow River, known as China's sorrow, provided the raw, terrifying material. Over generations, the collective experience of this hardship was shaped into a myth that served the needs of the society remembering it. The details of the story evolved to reinforce social values, the virtue of public service over private life, the ideal of the sage king who solves problems through wisdom and labor, and the divine right of a dynasty that traces its lineage back to this foundational hero. The myth becomes less about recording the exact event and more about explaining and justifying the current world order. It is a living story, its meaning shifting with the tides of history. This realization adds a profound layer of complexity to our search for a single origin. The Chinese tradition shows that even when cultures face similar environmental threats, devastating floods, they will craft stories that reflect their unique worldview. One culture might see the waters as a divine punishment requiring a covenant of obedience. Another might see them as an engineering challenge requiring a hero of administrative genius. The core experience of catastrophic flooding is universal, but the narrative built upon it is meticulously local. This means the global flood myth is not a single story passed from one source, but a chorus of independent voices, each singing of their own trauma in the key of their own culture. The memory is real, but its meaning is always under construction, shaped by the hands of those who tell it. Look at a map of the earliest human civilizations, and a clear pattern emerges. The great cradles of culture, Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates, Egypt along the Nile, the Indus Valley civilization around its mighty river, all share a single defining geographic feature. They were born on floodplains, these fertile ribbons of land deposited by the rivers themselves, offered the rich soil necessary for surplus agriculture, the precondition for cities, writing, and law. But they came with a terrifying price. To live there was to live with the constant, existential threat of the waters rising. This presents a provocative and compelling idea. Perhaps the Great Flood myth is more than a memory of a past disaster. Perhaps it is the foundational story for the very birth of civilization itself. The river was a paradox, both destroyer and life-giver. Its annual floods could arrive as a gentle, predictable blessing, spreading a layer of mineral-rich silt that acted as a natural fertilizer. This was the case with the Nile, whose inundation was so regular the ancient Egyptians based their calendar upon it, viewing it as the benevolent tears of the goddess Isis. But the same waters could also transform into a violent, unpredictable monster. The Tigris and Euphrates, fed by snowmelt from distant mountains, were far less predictable. A sudden surge could arrive without warning, breaching crude mud brick levees and sweeping away entire villages in a single night. This duality, the river as both creator and annihilator, was baked into the psyche of the first city dwellers. Archaeologist Dr. Henry Wright, who has studied the rise of early states, suggests this environmental pressure may have been a primary catalyst for social change. The collective effort to survive these cycles demanded innovation. Communities had to learn to predict the floods, leading to the development of astronomy and calendars. They had to control the water, leading to massive public works projects, the digging of irrigation canals, the building of dikes and reservoirs, and they had to organize the recovery and the fair redistribution of land after the waters receded, which required centralized authority, record-keeping, and legal codes. In essence, the struggle against the flood may have forced humanity to invent bureaucracy. The myth, then, becomes a profound cultural container for this entire experience. It encodes the trauma of the unpredictable disaster, the Tigris-Euphrates model of divine caprice that must be appeased, but it also encodes the hope of renewal, the Nile model of life emerging from the receding waters. The story of the flood is not just about survival. It is a story about the precariousness of human order in the face of natural chaos, and the monumental collective effort required to build that order again, stronger each time. The Ark is not merely a lifeboat. It is a metaphor for the city itself, a fragile vessel of knowledge, law, and technology, painstakingly built by communal effort to weather the storms of an uncertain world. Our oldest nightmare might just be the story of how we woke up and decided to build something that could last. The river's paradox as both creator and destroyer is mirrored within us. While geology searches for external evidence, another compelling line of inquiry turns inward, asking what these stories reveal about the architecture of the human mind itself. This is the realm of psychological and symbolic interpretation, where the flood is not a memory of water, but a metaphor for the universal experience of inner transformation. The pioneering psychologist Carl Jung introduced the idea of the collective unconscious, a deep layer of the psyche shared by all humanity, populated by universal patterns or archetypes. The Great Flood, in this view, is one of these fundamental archetypes. It represents the necessary and often terrifying process of dissolution, where the old structures of the self or the familiar world are overwhelmed to make way for something new. It is the psychological storm that precedes clarity, the emotional deluge that washes away outdated beliefs, forcing a rebirth of perspective. This reading finds powerful echoes in spiritual traditions across the globe, where water is rarely just water. In many faiths, ritual immersion or baptism uses water as a symbol of purification, of dying to an old life and emerging cleansed. The flood myth elevates this personal ritual to a cosmic scale. A beautiful illustration comes from Buddhist teaching in the parable of the raft. Imagine a traveler comes to a wide, flooded river, a dangerous torrent blocking the path forward. To cross, the traveler must build a raft from whatever materials are at hand: logs, branches, vines. Using great effort, they paddle across the treacherous waters to the safety of the far shore. The raft, representing the Buddha's teachings or any skillful means, was absolutely essential for the crossing. But upon reaching the other side, the wise traveler does not hoist the raft onto their shoulders and carry it for the rest of the journey. They leave it behind, grateful for its service but understanding its purpose was for the crossing, not for the entirety of the path ahead. The flooded river here is samsara, the cyclic existence of suffering, confusion, and endless change. The story is not about a historical event, but about the human journey through chaos toward liberation. This symbolic perspective does not seek to disprove the search for a real flood. Instead, it asks a different, equally vital question. Why would this specific symbol of total immersion, catastrophic loss, and precarious salvation hold such irresistible power for the human imagination, regardless of time or place? The answer may lie in a shared emotional truth. Every person in some season of life faces a personal flood. It might be the overwhelming tide of grief, the chaotic waters of a life upended by unexpected change, or the slow, rising anxiety that threatens to submerge our sense of order. The ancient myth gives a shape and a story to that profound internal experience. It tells us that such overwhelm, while terrifying, can also be a passage. It suggests that from the dissolution of the familiar shore, a new and unknown one can eventually be found. This psychological reading complements the geological detective work perfectly. One explores the landscapes of the earth, searching for the imprint of real water. The other explores the landscapes of the mind, understanding why the memory of that water, whether literal or symbolic, never leaves us. Together, they suggest the flood story endures not merely because something happened out there, but because something profound and universal happens in here, in the deep currents of human consciousness. The screen fills with images we know all too well: submerged city streets, rooftops peeking above muddy water, families being rescued by boat from what was once their neighborhood. These are not scenes from an ancient tablet, but from this morning's news. The ancient fear has not faded. It has simply changed its costume. Today, the stories of Noah and Gilgamesh and you feel less like distant legends and more like urgent dispatches from our own future. We are living in an age where the Great Flood is no longer a singular, mythical event, but a slow-motion, rolling catastrophe we see unfolding on our screens with every passing season. This is the Anthropocene, the age of human influence, and it has given the oldest story a terrifying new resonance. Environmental historian Dr. Maya Lin observes a crucial shift in perspective. For our ancestors, she notes, the flood was an external force, an act of gods or nature beyond human control. The story was about survival, resilience, and sometimes divine judgment. Today, the science is unequivocal. We are not passive witnesses to a changing climate. We are active participants in its creation. The rising seas, the intensifying storms, the unprecedented rainfall, these are not divine punishments, but the measurable consequences of collective human action. The floodwaters at our door are, in a very real sense, of our own making. This reframes the entire myth. The ancient warning against hubris, against upsetting the natural order, now reads like a precise diagnosis of our modern condition. The noise of mankind that disturbed the gods in the Atrahasis epic has become the industrial hum of civilization, altering the very chemistry of the atmosphere. We are not awaiting a capricious deity's decision. We are watching the physical results of our own choices accumulate, inch by inch, degree by degree. The global flood is no longer a metaphor for a sudden, world-ending event. It is a metaphor for a global, creeping emergency, one that inundates some communities first, but threatens to reshape the coastlines and climates of all. This connection forces a difficult but essential question upon us, one our ancestors might have recognized. Are we, the most technologically advanced civilization in history, heeding the caution buried within humanity's oldest stories? Or are we, with full knowledge of the consequences, playing the role of the civilization that refused to listen, that continued its clamor until the waters finally came? The myth today is no longer about where the water came from. It is about what we do now that we see it rising. This brings us to a critical crossroads in our journey where faith meets the fossil record. In the 20th century, a movement arose with the explicit aim of reconciling a literal reading of Genesis with the physical evidence of the earth. This framework, often called flood geology or creation science, proposes a radical reinterpretation of everything we have discussed. Its proponents argue that not just the flood story, but virtually the entire geological column, its layers, its fossils, its canyons, can be explained by the events of a single, year-long global deluge occurring just a few thousand years ago. It is an ambitious, all-encompassing theory that seeks to fit the sprawling epic of Earth's history into a drastically shortened timeline. To understand its appeal and its profound scientific shortcomings, we must examine its core claims with the same rigor we have applied to the rocks themselves. One of the most visually powerful arguments centers on the Grand Canyon. Flood geologists propose that this immense chasm was not carved slowly by the Colorado River over millions of years, but was excavated catastrophically by the receding waters of Noah's flood. They point to the canyon's sheer scale and suggest that only a continent-draining event of unimaginable power could have done such work. Similarly, they interpret the orderly sequence of fossil layers not as a chronicle of evolution over deep time, but as a snapshot of a pre-flood world buried in rapid succession. In this model, as the waters rose, bottom-dwelling sea creatures were buried first, forming the oldest layers. Then, as the flood advanced over the continents, it buried low-lying coastal swamps and forests, creating coal seams. Finally, terrestrial animals fleeing to higher ground were captured in the upper layers, with the most agile creatures, like humans, theoretically being buried last. To explain vast coal deposits, some proponents suggest a pre-flood world covered by a floating mat of vegetation, a global forest that was torn apart and sank during the catastrophe, creating the raw material for coal. When subjected to the meticulous tools of modern geology, however, this model fractures under the weight of its own contradictions. Let's start with the Grand Canyon. Geologists who have mapped its every layer explain that the story is written not in one event, but in many. The rocks themselves are a layered archive of ancient deserts, shallow seas, and river deltas that accumulated over hundreds of millions of years. The carving of the canyon came much later. Crucially, within those walls are layers of volcanic rock like the Cardenas basalt. Scientists can use radiometric dating on the minerals in these volcanic layers. This technique measures the steady, predictable decay of radioactive elements locked within the rock when it cooled. The dates returned are not ambiguous. They consistently show these basalts are over 1 billion years old. The canyon that cuts through them is therefore far, far younger, but still carved over a span of 5 to 6 million years by the persistent flow of the Colorado River and its tributaries. The evidence for this slow, patient erosion is everywhere in the intricate network of side canyons, the terraced cliffs, and the river's own sediment load. A single, catastrophic flood would have left a chaotic, scoured landscape, not this meticulously sculpted monument to incremental change. The fossil sequence presents an even greater challenge. The flood geology model predicts a rough ecological zoning, but the actual fossil record reveals a precise historical sequence that makes no ecological sense for a single event. Why would only trilobites and ancient corals be living in the pre-flood oceans, with no modern fish anywhere to be found? Why would dinosaurs be the only large land animals buried, with no rabbits, deer, or bears mixed in until much higher layers? The model also struggles mightily with specific, delicate features. How could a violent, globe-insurging cataclysm preserve the exquisite, undisturbed tracks of a dinosaur crossing a mudflat, or the intricate details of a leaf's veins, or the layered colonies of a coral reef growing in place? These require calm, specific conditions for preservation, not a year of planetary turbulence. The concept of a floating forest mat to explain coal fails on basic physics and chemistry. Coal forms from plant matter that accumulates in stagnant, waterlogged environments like peat bogs, where it is protected from decay and slowly compressed. A global mat torn apart and sunk in a violent flood would not create thick, pure seams of coal. It would create a widely scattered, mixed layer of shredded wood, sediment, and other debris. Furthermore, the intricate root systems found in the soils beneath many coal seams, known as underclays, show these plants grew in place in quiet swamps and were not transported by raging waters. Prominent geologists like Dr. David Montgomery, author of The Rocks Don't Lie, have engaged directly with these claims. He notes, while the desire to find harmony between scripture and science is understandable, the flood geology model requires one to disregard overwhelming, consistent evidence from multiple independent fields: physics, chemistry, paleontology, and stratigraphy. It is not a matter of interpreting the same data differently. It is a matter of rejecting the data itself. The scientific refutation is not an attack on faith, but a defense of a methodological process that builds understanding from observable, testable evidence. This distinction is vital. We can, and many do, hold the flood story as a profound cultural and spiritual narrative about human nature, resilience, and divine relationship. But when presented as a literal, scientific account of Earth's formation, it fails to match the physical reality we can observe, measure, and date. The myth's power lies in its meaning, not in its misplaced function as a geological textbook. The human desire to touch the proof of a story is powerful. It has driven explorers for centuries up the treacherous, icy slopes of a single, iconic mountain. Mount Ararat, a dormant volcano towering over the border of Turkey and Armenia, has been the focal point of the most famous archaeological quest in history, the search for Noah's Ark. The biblical account states the Ark came to rest upon the mountains of Ararat, a phrase later interpreted as this specific peak. This has made it a magnet for expeditions, each hoping to be the one to find the ultimate validation of the flood myth. Over the decades, claims have surfaced, often accompanied by compelling but ambiguous photographs. Aerial images of a peculiar boat-shaped formation in the rock and ice, known as the Ararat anomaly, have sparked intense speculation. Expeditions have returned with stories of sighting dark wooden beams high on the glacier, and some have even presented fragments of hand-tooled timber carbon dated to ancient times. The allure is undeniable, the possibility that a tangible piece of the legend is waiting, preserved in the perpetual ice. Yet for every claim, there is a formidable scientific rebuttal. Maritime archaeologist Dr. Selma Harrington, who specializes in ancient shipwrecks, outlines the sobering realities. A wooden vessel, even a large one, exposed on a mountain for thousands of years, would be subjected to relentless forces. Ice movement would crush and scatter it. Rockfalls and avalanches would bury it. If it were not buried in a protective environment like anoxic mud, the wood would simply rot away, eaten by microbes and fungi. Finding a specific, intact structure from a single, hypothesized event on one of the world's most geologically active and climatically harsh mountains is a needle in a haystack the size of a continent. The lack of a verified discovery, despite numerous attempts, speaks less to the truth of the story and more to the immense gap between a powerful narrative and the fragile, perishable nature of its potential props. A more fruitful approach has been to search not for the Ark itself, but for the world that might have inspired its story. This is where archaeology shifts from a treasure hunt to a methodical investigation of drowned landscapes. Perhaps the most prominent figure in this search is oceanographer Robert Ballard, famed for locating the Titanic. In the late 1990s, Ballard turned his sonar and remote-operated vehicles toward the Black Sea. His mission was not to find a ship, but to find a shore. Working from the hypothesis of a catastrophic flood around 7,600 years ago, his team began scanning the seafloor along the ancient pre-flood coastline. What they discovered was not a single artifact, but an entire lost world. They found the remains of a submerged river valley, complete with a former riverbed and fossilized shoreline. Most compellingly, they uncovered evidence of human habitation, including stone tools, ceramic fragments, and even a possible structure, lying hundreds of feet below the modern sea surface. Ballard's work did not prove the biblical flood, but it provided dramatic, tangible evidence that the Black Sea basin underwent a catastrophic transformation at a time when humans lived on its shores. It gave a specific, local geography to the kind of event that could seed a global legend, moving the search from mythic mountains to the silt-covered plains of a real, drowned frontier. This pattern of finding truth in submerged landscapes repeats across the globe. On the western coast of India, in the Gulf of Combat, archaeologists and geologists have investigated the ancient city of Dwarka. Hindu texts describe it as the magnificent, fortified capital of the god Krishna, a city of great splendor that was eventually consumed by the sea after his departure. For generations, this was considered pure mythology. Then, in the late 20th century, marine archaeologists began to locate structures. They found large stone blocks, pillars, and what appear to be the foundations of fortification walls scattered on the seabed. Pottery recovered from the site has been dated to around 3,500 years ago, a time that aligns with the traditional era of the Krishna legends. The discovery does not confirm the divine details of the story, but it strongly suggests that a major coastal settlement did exist there and was lost to the waters, likely due to a combination of rising sea levels and local subsidence. The memory of that loss, of a great city vanishing beneath the waves, was preserved and elaborated over centuries, woven into the fabric of religious epic. Here, archaeology reveals the core of truth, not in a floating zoo, but in a drowned city, a real place swallowed by the very environmental changes that shaped human history. These underwater findings offer a different kind of proof. They tell us that our ancestors did witness catastrophic inundations, that they did lose their homes and their lands to the rising sea. The stories they told about those events were not literal documentaries, but powerful, evolving narratives built upon a foundation of genuine, shared trauma. The Ark remains elusive, but the floodwaters, in a very real sense, have been found. The clay tablets of Mesopotamia were not a dead end, but a beginning. Their stories traveled, carried by traders, migrants, and scribes across the ancient Near East, evolving with every retelling. By tracing this literary journey, we witness something remarkable, not the recording of an event, but the conscious reshaping of a narrative to serve an entirely new vision of the world and the divine. The differences between the oldest version, the Epic of Catastrophes, and its most famous descendant in the Book of Genesis reveal a profound theological revolution. In the Babylonian account, the gods are a dysfunctional council. They send the flood not because humanity is wicked, but because their noise is intolerable, depriving the divine assembly of sleep. The decision is one of annoyance, not justice. One god, Enki, subverts the decree by whispering the warning to the reed wall of Atrahasis' house, a clever loophole that highlights the pantheon's internal discord. When the survivors offer a sacrifice after the waters recede, the text describes a grotesquely human scene. The starving gods, who had grown hungry because the flood wiped out the humans who fed them, smell the aroma and cluster around the offering like flies. It is a moment of divine desperation and pettiness, underscoring their flawed, almost childish nature. Now, read the Genesis account. The chaos of the divine council is gone, replaced by the singular, sovereign will of one God. The reason for the flood is explicitly moral. The earth is filled with violence and corruption. God sees this wickedness and is grieved in his heart. The decision, while severe, emerges from a framework of justice and sorrow, not capricious irritation. There is no whispering through walls, no divine deception. God speaks directly to Noah, a man found righteous, and gives clear, unambiguous instructions. And after the sacrifice, the biblical author performs a deliberate and telling edit. The image of God swarming like flies is entirely erased. Instead, God smells the pleasing aroma and makes a solemn, internal resolution. I will never again curse the ground because of humankind, for the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth. Nor will I ever again destroy every living creature as I have done. This is followed by the establishment of a covenant, a binding promise symbolized by the rainbow in the clouds. The focus shifts from divine need to divine commitment, from caprice to covenant. This literary evolution is not accidental. It represents a fundamental shift in religious consciousness. The ancient Mesopotamian world, you saw humanity as an afterthought, a labor force created to serve the gods, who were themselves powerful but morally ambiguous forces of nature. The Israelite theologians who shaped the Genesis narrative were crafting a different theology entirely. Their God was singular, transcendent, and fundamentally concerned with moral order. The flood story provided a powerful pre-existing framework, but they meticulously refined it, stripping away elements that conflicted with their vision of a just and purposeful deity. They transformed a tale of divine annoyance into a parable of moral reckoning and gracious promise. This comparative analysis reveals the true engine behind the flood myth's endurance. Its power does not stem from being a literal news report of a prehistoric event. Its power lies in its incredible adaptability, its capacity to be a vessel for a culture's deepest beliefs about the universe, justice, and humanity's place within it. The story was a living text, a narrative clay that could be reshaped to answer the most urgent questions of every generation that held it. The quiet libraries of 18th century Europe held two competing visions of Earth's past. On one side stood the biblical scholars and natural philosophers who saw in every mountain and canyon the shattered wreckage of divine catastrophes, with Noah's flood as the most recent and defining event. Their belief, later termed catastrophism, interpreted the landscape as a chronicle of sudden, violent revolutions sent by a higher power to punish and reshape a fallen world. It was a view that placed humanity at the center of a dramatic, morally charged geological story. Then, a Scottish gentleman farmer and keen observer of rocks named James Hutton offered a radical alternative. Walking the layered cliffs of his own estate, Hutton saw not the scars of ancient violence, but the patient work of an almost unimaginably ancient planet. In 1788, he presented a paper that would become the bedrock of modern geology. He proposed that the forces shaping the Earth, the slow uplift of mountains, the gradual erosion by wind and water, the endless cycle of sedimentation, were the same in the past as they are today. The key to the past, he famously argued, is the present. His vision was one of deep, cyclical time, summed up in a poetic and daunting phrase that the Earth showed no vestige of a beginning, no prospect of an end. This philosophy was named Uniformitarianism. It was a profound shift from a world shaped by supernatural catastrophe to a world shaped by natural, incremental process. For decades, these two camps were seen as irreconcilable. The catastrophists pointed to dramatic features like mountain ranges and fossil graveyards as proof of past paroxysms. The Uniformitarians, led later by Charles Lyell, countered that given enough time, the gentle drip of water could carve a Grand Canyon, and the slow accumulation of silt could bury entire forests. The debate was more than academic. It touched the very nature of time, history, and humanity's place in the cosmos. Was Earth's story a short, fiery epic punctuated by divine intervention, or a long, slow, impersonal epic written by wind and wave? The resolution, which forms the foundation of how geologists work today, came not from choosing one side, but from a brilliant synthesis. Modern Earth science recognizes that both philosophies hold essential truths. The uniformitarian principle is correct in its core insight. Most geological change is indeed gradual. The tectonic plates drift at the speed your fingernails grow. Rivers cut their valleys grain by grain over millennia. This framework of deep time allows us to read the planet's long, patient history. But we now also know that within that slow march, catastrophic events of staggering power do occur. The asteroid impact that ended the age of dinosaurs was a catastrophe. The megafloods that scoured the Channeled Scablands were catastrophes. The volcanic eruptions that bury cities in ash, or the earthquakes that suddenly uplift coastlines, are all catastrophic punctuation marks in Earth's long narrative. Today's geologist is neither a strict catastrophist nor a strict uniformitarian. They are a detective who asks, for this specific landscape, which combination of gradual process and sudden event best explains the evidence. This philosophical journey helps us finally place the global flood myth in its proper context. The myth represents the ultimate human expression of catastrophism, a story where a single, world-altering event explains everything. The evidence we have explored shows why that specific, literal version cannot be true. Yet, the discovery of real, regional catastrophes, the Black Sea inundation, the Storiga slide tsunami, the meltwater pulses, validates the human instinct that terrifying, landscape-altering floods are a part of our planetary experience. The truth, as it so often is, lies in the balanced, evidence-based middle ground. Our ancestors were not wrong to remember the waters. They simply condensed a complex reality of both slow change and sudden disaster into a single, unforgettable story. A story powerful enough to ignite a debate that would ultimately teach us how to read the story of the Earth itself. The words we use carry a deeper history than we often realize. A history that extends into the very structure of our oldest stories. When we listen to flood myths from distant continents, we are not just hearing similar plots, we are hearing echoes of a shared linguistic and imaginative past. This leads some scholars to propose the idea of a proto-myth, a single, ancient story about a great deluge told by our earliest ancestors before their descendants walked apart to populate the continents. It is a compelling thought that the narrative of Noah or Utnapishtim might be a fragmented memory, carried in the minds of migrating populations and slowly reshaped by thousands of years of separation. The field of comparative mythology actively searches for this kind of deep root, looking for cognates not just in language but in story. Do the names of the heroes share a common linguistic ancestor? Do the sequences of events, the specific symbols used, point to a common source? For instance, the name Noah has been linguistically linked by some researchers to earlier Mesopotamian figures like Utnapishtim and the even older Ziusudra, suggesting a chain of transmission where the character's identity evolved along with the language. This kind of detective work can trace a story's journey across millennia of written record. But here we encounter a significant challenge, one that folklorists are quick to point out. Stories are not locked in place. They travel with astonishing speed along trade routes, through conquest, and across cultural boundaries. A powerful tale heard by a merchant in a Babylonian marketplace could be retold in an Egyptian port within a generation, and then carried by a sailor to distant shores. This process, called diffusion, means that a shared story does not necessarily require a common ancestral population from 15,000 years ago. It could simply be a very good story that everyone wanted to tell. So how do we distinguish a story inherited from a common prehistoric ancestor from one that was simply borrowed in more recent times? The evidence becomes more persuasive when we find the same complex narrative in cultures that have been isolated from each other for immense stretches of time. Consider the Earth Diver motif, a creation story utterly different from the Genesis model, yet intimately connected to water. In this widespread myth found across northern Eurasia and among many Native American peoples, the world begins as a vast, endless ocean. A supreme being, often an animal like a muskrat, a loon, or a turtle, is commanded to dive deep into the primordial waters to bring up a bit of mud from the bottom. After several failed attempts by other animals, the successful diver returns with a tiny speck of earth in its paw or beak. This bit of mud is then placed on the water's surface, where it magically expands to form the entire habitable world. This is not a story of destruction by flood, but of creation from flood. The primordial waters are the starting condition of existence. The narrative logic, however, revolves entirely around the same elemental force, water, and the heroic act of retrieving solidity from liquid chaos. The fact that this specific, intricate plot appears on both sides of the Bering Land Bridge, in cultures separated for over 10,000 years, is a strong argument for incredible antiquity. It suggests that our ancestors, as they journeyed into new worlds, carried with them not just tools and fire, but a rich repository of narrative concepts about how the world came to be. They carried stories of water as both destroyer and creator. The global flood myth, then, may not be a single proto-story, but part of an ancient, shared pool of symbolic ideas. Our forebears did not need to experience one identical catastrophe to arrive at similar stories. They needed only to share a common human mind, a common awe of the power of the seas and rivers that sustained and threatened them, and a common need to explain the terrifying and magnificent paradox of a world born from, and occasionally reclaimed by, the deep. The floodwaters recede, leaving behind more than mud and debris. They leave a question that has troubled theologians and philosophers for millennia. If the story is about divine justice, what kind of justice is this? The narrative presents us with a staggering ethical equation: the deliberate drowning of nearly every living thing, from the elderly to the newborn, from human communities to the innocent creatures of field and forest, framed as a necessary act. This is where the myth moves beyond geology and into the deepest waters of human morality. How can such total annihilation ever be reconciled with the idea of a benevolent or just creator? This is the profound tension at the heart of the story, and different traditions wrestle with it in revealing ways. In the ancient Mesopotamian versions, the gods' motivations are startlingly human and flawed. They send the flood not out of righteous anger, but out of annoyance because the noise of humanity disturbs their sleep. Later, when the destruction is complete, they are gripped by regret and even terror at what they have done. The god Enlil, who ordered the flood, is furious that anyone survived. The narrative openly portrays the divine council as capricious and short-sighted, their grand punishment a messy overreaction they immediately come to rue. This framing doesn't solve the ethical problem, but it locates it within a world of morally ambiguous powers, a reflection of the unpredictable and often harsh nature of the universe as our ancestors experienced it. The biblical tradition performs a significant edit on this divine character. Here, the reason is explicitly moral. The earth is filled with violence and corruption. The decision emerges from a framework of justice, yet the text does not shy away from the emotional weight of the act. It states that God was grieved to his heart. This is a crucial detail. It introduces a note of divine sorrow, suggesting the punishment is not carried out with cold detachment, but with a kind of tragic necessity. The story then builds its famous resolution, the covenant. After the waters recede, God makes a solemn promise, etched with the sign of the rainbow, never to destroy all life in this way again. The reason given is startlingly honest, for the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth. It is an admission that the flood, as a solution, failed. You cannot purge evil from humanity because it is woven into our nature from the start. Therefore, God commits to a new path, one of patience and promise, choosing to work with a flawed creation rather than wipe it clean. This shifts the story's ultimate message from one of pure retribution to one of grace and commitment in spite of continued failure. So what are we to make of this today? Does the flood myth ultimately teach a morality rooted in fear, a warning that a powerful authority will punish transgression with overwhelming force? Or can we read it as a story about the failure of that very approach, a narrative that moves from the tragedy of absolute judgment to the hope of a second chance? Perhaps its enduring power lies in this very complexity. It forces us to confront uncomfortable ideas about collective punishment, the scope of justice, and what it means to be spared when others are not. It holds the spectacle of catastrophe in one hand and the fragile olive branch in the other, asking us which one we choose to see. The story does not provide easy answers. Instead, it holds up a mirror reflecting our own deepest struggles with fairness, mercy, and the terrible cost of survival. A mosaic of human imagination is painted across centuries, not on cave walls, but on chapel ceilings and cinema screens. The flood story has never been a static text. It is a living canvas, and every generation picks up a different brush. In the dim candlelight of a medieval scriptorium, a monk painstakingly inks a scene onto vellum. His ark is not a sleek ship, but a squat, boxy fortress, its decks teeming with animals rendered in symbolic, almost heraldic detail. The surrounding waters are a patterned sea of blue and green swirls, less a realistic ocean and more a symbolic representation of chaos. The focus here is not on the storm's violence, but on the divine order within the vessel, a floating microcosm of God's creation, preserved against the swirling disorder outside. This art served a devotional purpose, a visual sermon reminding the faithful of covenant and salvation. Fast forward to the Italian Renaissance, and the lens shifts dramatically. In Padua's Scrovegni Chapel, Giotto di Bondone paints his fresco of the flood. Here, the humanity of the catastrophe is laid bare. We see not a distant, symbolic boat, but the raw terror of those left behind. Figures scramble over rocks, clinging to each other as the waters rise around them. One man in desperation tries to strangle his neighbor, a brutal depiction of the collapse of society in the face of annihilation. Another reaches up toward the ark, his face a mask of futile hope, while a mother clutches her child, their fate sealed. Giotto's genius was to zoom in on the human cost, the despair and the moral unraveling that the text only implies. He used the biblical story to explore universal human emotions, making the ancient myth feel immediate and visceral to the 14th century viewer. The Enlightenment and the Romantic era brought a new awe, one directed at nature's sublime power. Painters like John Martin in the 19th century created vast theatrical canvases where the ark is a tiny speck amidst cataclysmic landscapes. Lightning splits heavens of apocalyptic orange and black, mountains crumble into raging seas, and the scale is overwhelmingly geological. This art reflects a growing scientific curiosity about the planet's power, projecting a newfound respect for natural forces onto the old theological framework. The ark becomes almost incidental, overshadowed by the spectacle of a world being violently remade. Then came the moving image. Cinema provided the ultimate tool for the flood myth, transforming it from a painted moment into a sensory experience. From the silent film epics with their practical effects to the digital age, the portrayal tracks our technological prowess and our changing anxieties. The 1920s film Noah's Ark mirrored the trauma of a generation that had just endured a world war, its massive sets and crowd scenes echoing the scale of modern industrial conflict. In 2007, Evan Almighty played the story for broad comedy, reflecting a culture more comfortable with parody than prophecy. But perhaps the most telling modern interpretation is Darren Aronofsky's 2014 film Noah. Here, artistic license is used not for spectacle alone, but for philosophical and environmental allegory. Russell Crowe's Noah is not a righteous patriarch, but a tormented, almost fanatical eco-warrior, interpreting the divine command through a lens of deep misanthropy and ecological guilt. The film's stunning, otherworldly visuals, the watchers as fallen angels trapped in stone, the creation sequence as a cosmic time lapse reimagine the myth as a dark parable for the Anthropocene. The flood is less a punishment for moral wickedness and more a brutal cosmic correction for humanity's ravaging of the planet. The CGI tsunamis are not just impressive, they are a visualization of nature's retribution, speaking directly to 21st century fears about climate catastrophe. This evolution continues into interactive media. Video games like The Last of Us or Horizon Zero Dawn present entire worlds shaped by a post-apocalyptic event, often a pandemic, but the narrative skeleton is the same. A cataclysm leaves a handful of survivors to navigate the ruins of the old world. The player doesn't just watch the arc, they build it, struggling to manage resources and morality in the aftermath. Each era's art holds up a mirror. The medieval manuscript reveals a society structured by faith and symbolic order. Giotto's fresco reveals a focus on humanism and emotional truth. The Romantic painting reveals a fascination with nature's awesome, indifferent power. The modern blockbuster reveals our technological hubris and our deep-seated anxiety about environmental collapse. The story itself is the constant, but its meaning is perpetually remade. This artistic journey ensures the flood is never a fossil, locked in a distant past. It is a vessel we keep rebuilding, loading it with our current fears, our moral dilemmas, and our most advanced tools, then setting it adrift once more for the next generation to find and reinterpret. The realization that the world was ancient did not come from a telescope pointed at the stars, but from a hammer striking stone. For centuries, the dominant human timeline was a short one, meticulously calculated by theologians from the generations listed in Scripture, placing creation and the Great Flood within a span of mere thousands of years. Humanity stood at the center of a recent and purpose-built cosmos. Then, in the late 1700s, a gentleman farmer in Scotland named James Hutton made a simple yet earth-shattering observation. Walking the layered sedimentary cliffs at Sycamore Point, he saw a dramatic unconformity where near vertical gray slate was capped by gently sloping red sandstone. He understood that to create such a junction required two immense cycles, the first layer deposited as sediment in an ancient sea, then tilted and eroded away over an unfathomable period before the second layer could slowly accumulate on top. He saw not catastrophe but cycles of almost endless renewal. In 1788, he presented his conclusion that the processes shaping the Earth required a timescale for which he famously saw no vestige of a beginning, no prospect of an end. This was the birth of the concept of deep time. Hutton's intellectual heir, Charles Lyell, championed this principle of uniformitarianism in his influential work, arguing that the present was the key to the past. The slow drip of water, the gradual uplift of a coastline, the patient accumulation of silt, these gentle forces, given enough time, could sculpt mountains and carve canyons. This was a direct, quiet challenge to the catastrophic worldview that required a recent global flood to explain every dramatic landscape. Historian of science Dr. Rebecca Smithers describes the psychological magnitude of this shift. Accepting deep time, she notes, was one of the most profound dislocations in human thought. It moved our species from the starring role in a short, divinely scripted epic to a late-arriving audience member in a play that had been running for billions of years before we took our seat. The stage was no longer built for us. We simply found ourselves upon it. This new chronology stretches the imagination to its breaking point. If we compress Earth's 4.5 billion-year history into a single calendar year, with January 1st as the planet's formation, life appears in the oceans around late February. The dinosaurs reign from mid-December until their sudden disappearance on the morning of December 26th. All of recorded human history, from the first cities to this very moment, occupies the last minute and a half of December 31st. Within that frantic final minute, the proposed Black Sea flood around 7,600 years ago occurs roughly 17 seconds before midnight. The great flood myths, which feel like foundational, ancient history to us, are in geological terms an event from mere moments ago. This does not diminish their power, but it fundamentally recontextualizes their origin. They are not eyewitness accounts to the planet's early days. They are stories born in our yesterday, crafted by minds that could not conceive of a world millions of years old, trying to make sense of terrifying experiences within a framework of a much shorter, more human-centric history. The mythic timescale measured from creation to flood in generations, a family tree we could trace. The geological timescale measures in epochs, a family tree whose roots are lost in the darkness of ages we can only measure, not truly feel. Embracing deep time does not erase the flood stories, it simply places them where they have always belonged, not as chapters in the Earth's autobiography, but as profound and moving entries in our own. 5.3 million years before the first human walked the Earth, the Mediterranean Sea died. It was not a gentle fading, but a brutal geological divorce from the world's oceans. For hundreds of thousands of years, the Strait of Gibraltar had risen, sealing off the Great Basin from the Atlantic. Cut off from its lifeblood, the Mediterranean evaporated under the relentless sun, shrinking into a nightmarish landscape of hypersaline lakes and vast, shimmering salt deserts over 2 miles below the level of the global sea. This period is known as the Messinian salinity crisis, and its end was one of the most violent single events in our planet's recent history. The evidence for this catastrophe is not hidden. It is written in colossal letters across the seafloor itself. When geologists began to map the bedrock beneath the Strait of Gibraltar using seismic imaging, they discovered something astonishing. Carved into the continental shelf was a single, gargantuan channel, a scar over 200 kilometers long, 8 kilometers wide, and in places 250 meters deep. This is not a river valley. It is the unmistakable signature of a flood of almost incomprehensible power, a wound cut directly through solid rock. Further proof lies in the layers beneath the blue water. Deep core samples have revealed that the Mediterranean seafloor is underlain by a massive deposit of salt and evaporite minerals, in some places over 2 kilometers thick. This is the ghost of the Dead Sea, the crystalline residue of an ocean that turned to dust. Then the dam broke. The precise trigger is still debated, a combination of tectonic movement and the relentless pressure of a global ocean held at bay. But the result is the clearest example we have of a planetary-scale deluge. The Atlantic Ocean found its weakness. What began as a trickle became a roar, and then an earth-shaking cataclysm. The best models suggest that once the breach reached a critical point, the entire weight of the Atlantic came pouring through the gap. The waterfall that formed would have dwarfed every cascade in human history combined. It is estimated to have been over a kilometer high, perhaps much more, with a flow rate thousands of times greater than the Amazon River. The sound alone would have been a continuous, continent-shaking thunder. The mostly dry basin, a deep, scorching hole in the Earth's crust, began to fill. the water did not creep in, it raced. Current scientific estimates, based on the volume of the basin and the potential flow rates, suggest the Mediterranean Sea as we know it was reborn in a geological instant, possibly in less than 2 years. Imagine watching from a hypothetical vantage point on Mars. You would see a brown, dusty basin over 3,000 kilometers long suddenly begin to gleam at its western end. A silver thread would appear, then widen with terrifying speed into a vast, churning cataract. The silver would spread eastward like a stain, day by day, month by month, until the entire colossal depression was filled with a new, brilliant blue ocean. This is the Zanclean flood. It is a fact of geology, not myth. While it occurred in a world without witnesses, it serves a crucial purpose in our understanding. It demonstrates with forensic clarity that the sheer scale of catastrophe described in human stories, while impossible for a global event, is absolutely within the realm of natural processes on a regional or continental level. The myths speak of waterfalls in the sky and oceans reclaiming the world in a matter of days. The Zanclean flood shows us that an ocean can indeed be born in a matter of months, and that waterfalls 1,000 meters high are not fantasy, but planetary mechanics. It provides the geological blueprint for the kind of event that, were it to happen in a human era, would unquestionably become the foundational trauma of a species, a story so vast it could only be told as the end of everything. The power of a story can eclipse the quiet authority of a date set. This is the central challenge of our age, where ancient narratives and modern science often speak past each other in a crowded public square. The flood myth, with its visceral imagery and moral weight, holds a gravitational pull that a graph of sea level rise or a cross-section of sedimentary rock struggles to match. In this landscape, the goal cannot be a simple contest of myth versus fact, where one must vanquish the other. The more fruitful path, and the more difficult one, is to build a bridge of respectful dialogue. This begins with a fundamental acknowledgement from the scientific community. The global flood story is not a failed science textbook, it is a profound cultural artifact. It carries the hopes, fears, and foundational beliefs of countless generations. Dismissing it as mere superstition ignores its immense psychological and social power, the very reasons it has survived for millennia. A geologist can stand before an audience and begin by honoring that power. They might say, our ancestors witnessed something so terrifying, so world-altering, that they wove it into the core of their identity. That story is a testament to human resilience and our need to make meaning from catastrophe. And then they can extend an invitation. Now, let us look at what the Earth itself has to say about those experiences. This approach transforms the myth from a battleground into a gateway. Science communicator Dr. Leo Chen advocates for this strategy. The story is the hook, he explains. It is the shared cultural reference point that grabs attention. Once you have that engagement, you can walk people through the real detective work. You can show them a Vav core and say, this is how we count years in mud, and we see no global catastrophe here. You can point to a fossil sequence and ask if all life was buried at once. Why are the dinosaurs never found with the woolly mammoths? The narrative becomes a starting line, not a finish line. It leads to conversations about how we know what we know, about radiometric dating, about plate tectonics, and about the incredible, patient method science uses to read the planet's autobiography. More urgently, it opens a direct channel to contemporary understanding. The ancient fear of drowning connects seamlessly to modern climate models projecting coastal inundation. The story of a world reshaped by water becomes a powerful metaphor for the planetary changes we are driving today, making the abstract science of atmospheric carbon personally and historically resonant. Ultimately, the investigation into the Great Flood reveals a grander narrative than the story itself. It charts the evolution of human understanding. For most of our history, we sought answers in story, in the wisdom of elders and the will of the gods. These stories provided order, meaning, and community in a chaotic world. The scientific revolution offered a new path, a method for building knowledge from observable evidence, testable hypotheses, and reproducible results. This was not a rejection of our need for meaning, but a new way to satisfy it. The journey from the Epic of Gilgamesh to the core samples from the Greenland ice sheet is not a story of one truth replacing a lie. It is the story of humanity growing new tools for curiosity. We learn to listen to the rocks as well as the legends. The value of holding the flood myth up to the light of geology is not that it shatters the old vessel, but that it shows us how far we have sailed. It demonstrates our species' remarkable transition from explaining the world through powerful parables to understanding it through patient, collective evidence. In this light, the ancient story ceases to be a point of division between faith and reason. Instead, it becomes an unparalleled educational tool, a deep well of shared human experience from which we can draw a more nuanced, evidence-based, and humble appreciation for our place on this dynamic, ancient, and vulnerable planet. The map of human memory and the map of Earth's scars begin to align. We have traveled from the whispered warnings in ancient epics to the silent testimony of ice cores and canyons, and now a coherent picture emerges from the seeming contradiction. The global flood myth is not a geological report, but a psychological and cultural masterpiece. It is the human mind's profound act of narrative compression, taking countless generations of traumatic encounters with rising waters, the relentless creep of post-glacial seas, the sudden horror of a tsunami, the devastating breach of a river's banks, and weaving them into a single, unforgettable story of a world drowned and reborn. This compression is the genius of cultural memory, a process that distills repeated, shared hardship into a foundational legend that explains the past, guides the present, and warns the future. The story becomes an arc in itself, carrying the emotional truth of survival across the vast ocean of time. Consider that map once more, dotted with hundreds of flood traditions. Now overlay it with the known geography of our planet's turbulent adolescence after the last ice age. The regions dense with flood myths, the Mediterranean basin, the Persian Gulf, the coasts of Southeast Asia, the Americas, are precisely the areas most severely reshaped by rising sea levels and vulnerable to seismic tsunamis. The fertile plains where early civilizations took root, the very cradles of these stories, were also the landscapes most susceptible to catastrophic inundation. This correlation is not a coincidence. It is a correlation of cause and effect, of experience and expression. The people living in these zones did not imagine a threat. They lived under its constant shadow. A community might pass down a story of a great flood sent by the gods, while just offshore, the drowned forest of their ancestors' hunting grounds lay preserved beneath the waves, a silent, submerged proof of their legend's core truth. This synthesis offers us a powerful and humane resolution. We do not have to choose between dismissing the myths as fiction or rejecting science to uphold them. We can hold both truths in hand. The geological record is unequivocal. A planet-covering deluge that submerged every mountain never happened. Yet, the human record is equally clear. Our ancestors repeatedly faced waters that ended their world as they knew it. The Black Sea flood hypothesis, the Storegga slide tsunami, the relentless meltwater pulses, these are not the global flood, but they are the very kinds of events that feel global to those who endure them. When the only world you have ever known disappears beneath a relentless tide, the distinction between a regional and a global catastrophe is meaningless. Your entire universe has been washed away, so the Great Flood emerges not as a historical event, but as a historical experience refined over millennia into a perfect archetype. It is a story built from real water and real fear, compressed and amplified by generations of telling. It carries the trauma of displacement, the awe of natural power, the hope for a covenant with the forces that shape our lives, and the timeless warning about the fragility of human order. The myth is the echo, and we have finally triangulated its source not to a single point in time or space, but to a shared chapter in the human story, written when the oceans were rising and the future was a vast, uncertain shore. In honoring both the depth of the story and the rigor of the stone, we do more than solve an ancient mystery. We learn how to listen to the many ways our world and our own memories tell their truth. The echo of that ancient warning still ripples through our modern world, a testament to its enduring power. Our journey through the labyrinth of the flood myth has led us to a place of profound synthesis, where story and stone finally speak in harmony. We have seen that the legend of a world drowned is not a literal chronicle of Earth's past, but something far more revealing. It is a masterpiece of human memory. It is the collective psyche taking the raw, terrifying material of countless regional disasters, the relentless creep of post-glacial seas, the sudden horror of tsunamis, and compressing them into a single, archetypal narrative of catastrophe and rebirth. The geological evidence is clear and patient, dismantling the possibility of a single global deluge. Yet, in that very act of dismantling, it uncovers a planet scarred by very real, shattering floods, events that truly did end worlds for the people who witnessed them. This is the beautiful resolution. The myth is not a falsehood to be discarded, but a map of meaning drawn in the language of fear, hope, and moral reckoning. It shows us how our ancestors made sense of overwhelming chaos, how they sought purpose in loss and forged covenants with an unpredictable universe. Science, in turn, provides the meticulous map of the territory, charting the actual rivers of time, the real layers of Earth, and the genuine forces that shape our physical home. These two maps are not in conflict. They are complementary guides to understanding our place in a vast and dynamic story. As we stand today on the shores of our own uncertain future, facing an era of rising seas driven by our own hands, these ancient tales resonate with a new and urgent clarity. They are not prophecies but profound reminders of a fundamental truth we have always known, that water gives life and can just as easily take it away. They speak to our deep-seated vulnerability before natural forces, but also to our incredible resilience, our stubborn drive to build arcs of knowledge, community, and hope against the coming storm. The investigation into humanity's oldest nightmare ultimately becomes a lesson in listening, to the wisdom encoded in our oldest stories and to the evidence written in the very bones of our planet. If this exploration of where deep memory meets deep time has captivated you, consider subscribing for more journeys to the places where history and mystery intertwine. What other ancient legends, from lost continents to fiery chariots in the sky, might hold a hidden kernel of geological or astronomical truth? Share your thoughts below, and let us continue the search together.